Federal officials are calling today's guilty plea a big break in their investigation of the Penn Square Bank failure. The bank closed its doors in July of 1982, and in the following 18 months, a host of federal officials have been looking at numerous suspicious loans authorized by bank officials. Today in federal court, former Penn Square Bank Executive Vice President Thomas Orr of Edmond pleaded guilty to tax evasion and conspiracy. The charges alleged Orr owed more than $300,000 in back taxes, and that he was involved in a loan scheme involving the purchase of thoroughbred racehorses, where Orr got a commission from the buyers. Officials charged some of the loans were disguised as oil and gas loans.
Significant amount of borrowing that ended up of bad loans that failed later that helped contribute to the downfall of the bank were loans that were originated by Mr. Orr, and so it's a portion of the criminal conduct that is being investigated, a significant portion, and is something that we therefore had been working on and achieved results.
Orr becomes the first bank official to face charges for activities leading to the collapse of the bank. He could go to jail for 10 years and be fined up to $20,000. And officials say Orr has agreed to cooperate with the government in the investigation of others connected with the bank's failure. Jeff Fowler, Action 4.
Every time Oklahoma gets a bout of snow, the State Transportation Department dispatches workers to clear the roadways. There is no way to predict when a winter storm will hit, so it's hard for the DOT to come up with a budget for such purposes. This year, the department allotted $3.5 million for road cleanup, but the Arctic blast in December cost the state $1 million of that. If we get another couple of big storms, the department may run out of money.
If we overspend, say for instance we spend $5 million on snow and ice this year, then something else got to give come spring, such as litter, surface repairs, and those type of things.
And of course, the snow not only costs the department a lot of money to clear away, it will also cost money to repair the damage of the constant freezing, thawing, and refreezing on the roads. Potholes and chug holes will undoubtedly be the result. And the department may not have a big enough pot to pay for the repairs. Bella Shaw, Action 4.
That it's a good opportunity. Sure. Not to prejudge a committee that has never met, never been appointed, and to say, and we need to set in concrete as much as possible that funding level. It is not to be a committee that only does what the governor's office requests. And in appointing these 10 members to an executive committee, I'm saying the commission can add as many as they want to in addition to that. These 10 will serve as the organizing committee. But I want the commission to set the main thrust. We will, of course, give them a charge of what we think is appropriate, but I want them to have full run of the area of interest that they have.
Okay, thanks.
The reason for a furlough, of course, is to not have to lay people off or basically to not have to fire people. And so we're doing this to save money and to do whatever is necessary to help us with our budget plan.
Between now and the end of the session?
Senator, we are easing the crunch by, as you probably have been aware, the
to look at the elimination of some
12.1% from our original 18 short months.
Be further.
Our agencies are operating on a 13% budget cut as mandated to us by our constitutional amendment. If we don't pass 1451, we're going to force those agencies to continue to operate at that rate and any subsequent rate in which the constitutional revenue mandates to us, and which most folks have indicated will be an average of 20% over the next few months. So by passage of your bill today, while it is painful in one aspect, we are going to be able to relieve the budget strain that some of the schools suffer under somewhat.
Edmond is the fastest growing school district in the state. The district has already had to cut back on field trips and other extracurricular activities to make ends meet. The voters in Edmond are being asked to approve a $15 million levy for the general fund. The money will be spent on teachers' salaries and basic operational expenses. But school officials are worried some voters might think they're voting for a tax increase.
There's talk of a tax increase in the legislature, and sometimes people, I think, do not clearly understand the difference between the different taxes, and so they may be thinking this is a tax increase, and of course we hope they do not think that.
The mill levy is expected to pass, especially since 50% of those people voting are teachers located right here in their own building. Meantime, school officials are happy that this vote is called a mill levy and not a tax increase. Bella Shaw, Action 4 in Edmond.
The key to a dynamic decade is vigorous economic growth, our first great goal. We might well begin with common sense in federal budgeting, government spending no more than government takes in. We must bring federal deficits down. America has always been greatest when we dared to be great. We can reach for greatness again. We can follow our dreams to distant stars, living and working in space for peaceful economic and scientific gain. Tonight, I am directing NASA to develop a permanently manned space station and to do it within a decade.
But we might not have any answers on it next week. Is that right?
Well, and they haven't explained it to me to my satisfaction yet.
In fact, even the chairman of our appropriation committee doesn't know, and it may not be enforced.
Of whether all of us are pleased with it or not is that we must turn our attention to the important thing in this state, and that is to rebuild the tax base that we have destroyed over the last 7 years. That will take all of our time and attention, and will take the cooperation of the North Wall and the South Wall, the urban element and the rural element. That's what we need to be working on.
We don't have a fight with Wilson Foods. Our fight is with our beef processors because we feel it's in the best interest of our state, our community, the people that work for Wilson throughout the United States, for Wilson to survive, that we might work out our differences, however serious they may be, in the future.
There's no way under the current law that once you get that ticket to be a policeman anywhere in the state, no way it can be taken away from you. We in the law enforcement community know of several instances where policemen would either be terminated or resign for offenses for which he could have been terminated prior to that happening. He'd come in and quit, end up somewhere else in the state and working. We don't think that's in the best interest of law enforcement or the state for that to happen.
It's really nice to see you, isn't it, West?
Hey, Unicornman, how are you today? My name is Dan D. Dynamo, Superintendent of the Space Science Center and Supreme Galaxy Chief of the Universe Science Corps. I salute you. And today's meeting is now in session. Have we got a lot of problems on our mind? You know, there's a mysterious girl from outer space who has come here to the Space Science Center.
Try to help direct any questions to the appropriate party. At this time, I think to Dave here.
Well, the department gave us additional information to show that they already cut 800. I'm not being specific with this.
The Department of Human Services up to speed, because I believe Mr. Fulton is doing since the legislature directed us to do it, that it would be a management tool for the legislature to use in bringing, and I'm hesitant to say bring the Department of Human Services up to speed, because I believe Mr. Fulton is doing the very best that he humanly can. But I think it should be used as a tool to monitor the recommendations.
The issue on the tax increase debate was the same issue on the budget cutting debate. Legislators are fearful of what will happen to schools across the state. Already, education has taken millions of dollars in cuts. The lawmakers on the floor and the spectators in the gallery say the cuts have already gone too deep, and further cuts next year would be disastrous. Even Republican members who would traditionally oppose a tax increase say they didn't feel they had a choice.
That 1 cent is not going to help my school one bit. But what it will do is maybe keep them from firing my only drug counselor. When we cut last week, guess where we cut? A drug counselor with 16,000 school kids. I resent that.
Other Republicans echoed Cole's feelings. They said a vote for the tax increase was not a vote for the way the state was being run. Instead, they see it as a quick fix for an immediate problem. Over the long run, Republicans and Democrats alike say they will continue to look for further cuts and reforms in state government. The House vote was 83-18 in favor of the sales tax hike. The Senate is expected to begin consideration sometime next week. Charles Schnitzer, Action 4 at the state capitol.
Nicorette should be arriving in the Oklahoma City market by the end of this month. It's basically a gum containing nicotine that, when taken properly, can dramatically reduce the urge to smoke. Nicorette slowly allows a small amount of nicotine into the bloodstream, rather than much larger amounts from cigarettes. It is only prescribed after a person truly decides to quit smoking. Dr. Deanne Whitehead explains why the gum fix is so beneficial.
The purpose of the gum is to get people off cigarettes permanently. They have also found in their studies that the gum is not very addicting, whereas cigarettes are very addicting. So if somebody could quit smoking and start chewing the gum and chew the gum whenever they get an urge, then they could finally give up the gum, hopefully at least 3 months down the road.
There is a part of you that really is not going to want to quit, and that's going to be the part of you that starts making excuses.
Completing programs like this one to help quit smoking are first advised before trying Nicorette. Motivation is still the key to success, and Nicorette can only work if it is aided by the willpower not to smoke. Ed Stewart, Action 4.
I told you before, we all have...
In Europe, they used any kind of hibernating animal, which in this case most of the time was a bear. And then when the tradition came over to America, there was a shortage of bears and they started using groundhogs. So we don't have a groundhog here at the zoo, so we thought we'd go back to the original tradition and see what our bears did.
The defense called on co-defendant Ronald Hope to give his version of what happened the night Larry Ellis was gunned down. Hope said he was hiding across the road when Ellis drove up. Hope testified he heard 4 or 5 gunshots going off, and then he saw co-defendant Kendall Vowell standing next to Ellis's truck, reloading a revolver. Vowell testified earlier that Hope was the trigger man. The Cleveland County prosecutor attempted to point out inconsistencies between Hope's story and the testimony of half a dozen other witnesses. The defense ended its presentation after hearing from a pair of county jail inmates who swore they heard Kendall Vowell and a third inmate plot to pin the murder blame on Ronald Hope. Following the rebuttal witnesses, both sides rested their cases. The jury will hear the judge's instructions and then final arguments, and then decide the fate of Kendall Vowell and Ronald Hope. Scott Wallace, Action 4 in Norman.
We met with the governor's office this morning and with the attorney general's office and the State Department of Agriculture to try to determine what legal authorities the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health had given a voluntary standard.
In other words, you're worried about possibly getting sued if you pulled something off the shelf.
Well, yeah, that's a distinct, clear and present, truthful possibility. We could get sued if we didn't have some basis for any actions we took.
Mainly University College classes. I have no degree. Federated Junior Women's Clubs and all of the different offices and systems within our state, things that have been hurt by our...
I feel like crime has become a daily threat to our lives and safety. And as your state senator, I will promote swift and just punishment as a deterrent to crime.
We're scared. I walked much of the district. I was told I couldn't do it, and it couldn't be done, but I spent early mornings and late evenings doing it. And the one thing I found out is that people are in their homes and they're locked up. And they've got dogs in the fence or in the house and they're afraid.
You didn't know? Is that you in that helicopter?
Sure.
I put the spotlight on one and I see somebody shine light back.
Get a picture of me, man!
It was just random and what they could come up with off the top of their head. There was no uniformity to it, no purpose to it whatsoever. It was just isolated fires here. We'd get that one put out. There'd be another one started. We'd go get it put out. And it was just hit and miss all along.
You know, when you think about epilepsy, you probably think of a person who falls to the floor and begins to jerk uncontrollably. Well, that is one form of epilepsy. But there's some other more subtle forms that we'd like to talk about. Petit mal epilepsy is usually seen in children. Now, parents might not even realize that their child has this form of epilepsy. Dr. Luther Wilmore says a child's teacher may be the first to notice it.
Petit mal epilepsy is very subtle. It involves maybe some eye blinking, maybe little movements of the hands or the mouth. But the child, and typically it's a childhood disease, has an abrupt onset of loss of contact with whatever's going on in the environment, and then abrupt return to normal. And a school teacher is a very critical person in picking up this form of epilepsy because the grades will begin to fall, the child will have little dull-looking spells.
Now, the reason their grades drop is because these so-called dull spells often occur quite frequently. They may last only 10 to 20 seconds at a time, but they may occur as often as 50 to 100 times a day. Now, the good news is that most children outgrow this kind of seizure by adolescence, and it doesn't usually pose much danger to the child's health, unless, of course, the child is doing something where he needs to be in control, like riding a bicycle. If a seizure occurs during such an activity, it could be quite dangerous. Now, like we said a minute ago, the parents of children with petit mal epilepsy may be the last to realize it. These children may be just dismissed as daydreamers. Now, if you think your child has symptoms to go along with something like we have described, why don't you check with your physician? At least you'll know. I'm Dr. Red Duke. You know, epilepsy may not be something you're necessarily born with. It may occur as a result of a head injury later in life or in the beginning of life during childbirth. Any form of tissue injury is always followed by scarring, including the brain. The result is a form of seizure we call focal seizures. They are not the dramatic jerking seizures that we commonly associate with epilepsy.
A person may be driving an automobile or doing some work and then have sudden loss of conscious contact, yet their motor function or their arms and legs still continue to work properly. They won't necessarily fall. There will be some chewing movements or rhythmic movements of the face or mouth. The patient may pick at their clothing. If they're doing something with their hands, they may have a parody of normal function, but they may continue to not quite do it as accurately as they could or should.
Now, some forms of focal epilepsy have jerking and twitching just like regular epilepsy, but it's usually confined to an extremity like an arm or maybe even just a thumb. Now, this type of epilepsy can be controlled through prescribed drugs just like other forms of epilepsy. But some focal epilepsy patients have been completely cured by having the affected area of the brain surgically removed. Sometimes the scarred area of the brain is in an area that you can afford to have removed. Now, in all likelihood, these operations will become even more common in the future. They're done in major medical centers now, and it'll probably continue to be done in such places. Now, if you think you have such a problem or know someone has it, why don't you check with your physician? I'm Dr. Red Duke. You know, when you think of epilepsy, what probably comes to mind is the image of what we docs call a grand mal seizure. Now, that can be a very frightening episode to witness if you don't know what's going on.
Typically, the patient will suddenly fall to the ground, become very stiff, may cry out as the chest muscles are constricted and the vocal cords are constricted, giving a high-pitched cry, sometimes referred to as the epileptic cry. And this is then followed by a very stiff body position, and then rhythmic jerking of the arms and the legs. This sequence goes on for maybe 5 minutes. Then the person having this form of seizure is totally comatose or totally unconscious.
Now, these epileptic seizures can be completely controlled in most instances through medication. The hardest thing for an epileptic to overcome is the change in lifestyle.
People lose their driver's license. They have difficulty with insurance. As school children are embarrassed by their peers if they've had a seizure, they're called names.
Employee applications usually ask people to identify any health problems. Epileptics often suffer from the stigma that somehow being an epileptic might not make a good employee.
Employers don't necessarily understand that there are very good data that show that people with epilepsy make excellent employees, even though they're having problems with seizures.
Now, everybody needs to know what to do if they happen to be in the presence of a person who has a grand mal seizure. We'll talk about that the next time. I'm Dr. Red Duke.
If any of them are selected in the near future, there will still be several months during which they're feeling their way, really still consulting the other members of the ruling committee. So I would say in 1984, not much change, but once the American elections are over and once the new man really gets firmly entrenched in power, in 1985, that could be the year when we could see a real shift in direction of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union.